The pullover. On the outskirts of the bustling city, where traffic thinned and the quiet, winding roads seemed worlds away from the urban chaos, two white police officers, Sergeant Randy Harris and Officer Tom Martin, were stationed for their evening shift. Their patrol car was parked on the edge of the road, where overhanging trees cast long shadows over their dusty windshield, giving the scene an eerie stillness. Randy, a seasoned officer with a gruff demeanor and a rigid view of the world, sat in the driver's seat, muttering about the good old days of policing and grumbling about what he viewed as unnecessary reforms that he felt were ruining tradition. Beside him, Tom, a younger, more impressionable officer with barely 2 years on the force, listened in silence, his face showing signs of discomfort as Randy's complaints grew louder. "Back in my day, there was respect," Randy sneered, adjusting the rearview mirror to look down the empty road. "These new policies, all they do is pamper criminals, give them the upper hand. No respect for authority anymore." Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat, staring out the window. He had learned early on that it was best not to respond when Randy went off on his tirades. But tonight, Randy's bitterness felt particularly intense, almost like he was waiting for an excuse to unleash his frustrations. Suddenly, a car appeared in the distance, slowly making its way down the road. It was an old sedan, worn around the edges but kept in good condition. The engine made a soft hum, and the headlights were faint in the evening dimness. Inside the car, a black man in his early 40s drove with a relaxed composure, one hand on the wheel and a calm expression on his face as he enjoyed the peaceful drive. Randy narrowed his eyes, a glint of mischief flashing across his face. Well, look what we have here," he muttered. "An old, beat-up car and a driver that doesn't seem to be in a hurry to get anywhere. Looks suspicious to me." Tom turned to him, a faint line of concern creasing his forehead. "Maybe he's just driving carefully, Randy. It's a quiet road." But Randy had already made up his mind. He smirked as he switched on the patrol car's lights, the red and blue flashing against the darkening sky. "Come on, Tom. Let's have some fun, shall we? Lighten up the shift a little. Let's see what this guy's up to." Before Tom could voice any objections, Randy activated the siren, and their car pulled out onto the road, accelerating to close the distance between them and the unsuspecting driver. As they neared the old sedan, Randy flipped on the loudspeaker. "Pull over," Randy barked, his voice reverberating through the speaker. "Driver, pull over to the side of the road immediately." The driver glanced in his rearview mirror, his calm gaze meeting the flashing lights. Without hesitation, he signaled and pulled over, easing his car to a gentle stop by the curb. As Randy parked behind him, he chuckled, already relishing what he saw as an entertaining diversion from a dull shift. Randy stepped out of the patrol car with a swagger, his heavy footsteps purposeful as he approached the driver's window. Tom followed behind, less sure of himself, glancing around nervously as he felt an uncomfortable sense of dread creeping up his spine. There was something about this whole scenario that felt wrong, but he couldn't quite place it. The driver rolled down his window, revealing a face marked by quiet confidence. He was neatly dressed in a dark t-shirt and a casual jacket, his eyes calm and observant as he looked up at Randy without a hint of fear or unease. Randy was momentarily thrown off by the man's calm demeanor, but quickly masked his surprise with an authoritative scowl. "License and registration," Randy demanded, his voice laced with a thinly veiled tone of disdain. "Is there a reason you were driving so slowly back there?" The driver maintained eye contact, his voice steady as he handed over his documents. "I was simply following the speed limit, officer. There's no need to rush on this road." Randy's eyes narrowed as he took the documents, glancing down at the driver's license. "What's a guy like you doing driving an old rust bucket like this?" he sneered, loud enough for the driver to hear. "Lucky it still runs at all." The driver didn't flinch, his calm gaze unbroken. "I take good care of my car, officer. And as you'll see, my paperwork is all in order." Randy's face darkened as he studied the license, muttering under his breath. There was something unsettling about the man's composure, a quiet dignity that seemed immune to Randy's condescending tone. Frustrated, Randy decided to push further, determined to find something to fault. "Get out of the car," he snapped, stepping back and gesturing toward the curb. "Let's have a closer look at this rust bucket." Without protest, the driver unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car, his movements unhurried. He stood by the roadside, his posture relaxed as Randy and Tom circled the vehicle, peering through the windows and checking the license plate. Tom felt a wave of unease as he watched Randy's behavior grow increasingly hostile. This was supposed to be a routine stop, but Randy seemed determined to escalate it. As Randy finished his inspection, he turned back to the driver, his face twisted in a smirk. "Mind telling me why a man like you is driving such an old car in this part of town?" he asked, his tone dripping with contempt. The driver met Randy's gaze steadily. "I'm a man who values simplicity, officer. I don't believe a car's age defines its worth. It gets me where I need to go." Randy's smirk faltered, replaced by a scowl. He wasn't used to people talking back, especially not with such quiet confidence. He stepped closer, invading the driver's personal space as he spoke in a low, threatening tone. "Maybe you don't understand who you're talking to," he hissed. "I'm the one with the badge, and that means you do what I say. Or would you rather I arrest you for resisting?" The driver's calm expression didn't waver. "Officer, with all due respect, I don't see how my compliance has been an issue. I followed your instructions and provided all necessary documents. If you feel the need to escalate this further, I'd advise you to consider whether it's truly warranted." Tom shifted uncomfortably, feeling a surge of guilt and confusion. He wanted to intervene, to tell Randy to back off, but his fear of going against his superior held him back. He cast a quick glance at the driver, who gave him a slight nod, as if sensing his inner conflict and offering silent reassurance. Just then, a small crowd of onlookers began to gather nearby, curious about the commotion. Some held up their phones, recording the encounter. Randy noticed this and clenched his fists, feeling his authority slip under the watchful eyes of the growing audience. A woman's voice from the crowd called out, "What's going on here? Why are you harassing him?" Another man chimed in, "Yeah, we're all watching, officer. This doesn't look right." Randy's face flushed with anger as he glared at the crowd. He hated being challenged, especially by civilians. Turning back to the driver, he barked, "Step over here. Now." The driver raised an eyebrow, his calm gaze unyielding. "Is there something specific you need from me, officer? Or am I free to leave?" Randy opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a sudden voice from behind. "Sergeant Harris, what's the situation here?" Everyone turned to see an older man in a suit approaching. He carried himself with an air of authority, his piercing gaze assessing the scene. Randy recognized him instantly and felt his stomach drop. This was Captain Matthews, his superior. Captain Matthews was known for his no-nonsense approach and his commitment to integrity within the department. Randy stammered, "See Captain Matthews. I was just conducting a routine stop." Captain Matthews glanced at the driver, his expression unreadable. "A routine stop, huh?" He looked back at Randy, his voice cold. "Do you know who this man is?" Randy's face paled as he looked between the driver and his captain, realization dawning on him too late. He didn't know. He had stopped the man without cause, targeted him based on his assumptions, and now his arrogance had caught up to him. Captain Matthews turned to the driver with a respectful nod. "Apologies for the inconvenience, Captain Williams. I assure you, this matter will be addressed." The crowd murmured in shock, and Randy's face drained of color. The man he had pulled over, taunted, and threatened was none other than his future superior, Captain David Williams, recently appointed to lead the precinct in their district, a man known for his commitment to justice and equality. Captain Williams met Randy's gaze, his expression one of calm disappointment. "Thank you, Captain Matthews," he said quietly. I trust you'll handle this appropriately." As Captain Williams returned to his car, the weight of the crowd's disapproval hung in the air. Randy stood frozen, humiliated and ashamed, realizing that his actions had exposed not only his own prejudice, but the need for change within the force. The first cracks had formed, and he knew his career would never be the same. The fallout begins. As Captain Williams drove away, the tension in the air remained thick. The onlookers had recorded everything, murmuring among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Randy's face was pale, his expression a mix of shock and shame. He couldn't believe what had just happened. The man he had harassed, treated with open disdain, was not only a fellow officer but the newly appointed captain. The realization left him speechless, his bravado shattered. Officer Tom Martin, still standing by the patrol car, felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over him. He had known from the start that the stop was unjustified, that it had been Randy's way of exerting control, fueled by biases he hadn't bothered to hide. But now, seeing his superior reduced to silence and witnessing the consequences of Randy's actions, Tom felt a new sense of resolve brewing within him. Captain Matthews, who had stayed behind to address the onlookers, turned to Randy with an icy stare. "Get in the car, Sergeant Harris," he commanded, his voice calm but dripping with authority. Randy hesitated, but he knew better than to defy his captain now. Silently, he climbed into the passenger seat, his head down, avoiding the stares of the crowd. Tom followed suit, feeling the weight of what had transpired pressing down on him. The drive back to the precinct was silent, punctuated only by the soft hum of the engine. Randy stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, while Tom occasionally glanced at him, a mixture of pity and frustration simmering within him. He knew that what had happened was only the beginning, that there would be consequences for the actions they had taken that evening. When they finally arrived at the precinct, Captain Matthews parked and got out, motioning for Randy and Tom to follow him inside. As they entered the building, the usual buzz of activity seemed to hush. Officers and staff looked up, curious and apprehensive, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Captain Matthews led the two officers to a conference room, closing the door behind them. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chairs across the table. Randy slumped into his seat, his shoulders hunched, while Tom sat stiffly, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. Captain Matthews took a seat across from them, folding his hands and looking at Randy with an intensity that made even Tom feel uncomfortable. "Do you realize the gravity of what you did tonight, Sergeant Harris?" Captain Matthews began, his voice measured but stern. "You pulled over Captain Williams, a man who has dedicated his life to serving this city, without any valid reason. You disrespected him, threatened him, and treated him as though he were a criminal based on nothing but your own biases. This is not only a disgrace to the badge, but a direct violation of our oath to serve and protect." Randy swallowed hard, his face flushed. I didn't know he was our new captain," he stammered, trying to regain some composure. "If I had known." Captain Matthews held up a hand, silencing him. "That's exactly the problem. Sergeant, it shouldn't matter who he is. You shouldn't have treated any citizen the way you treated him tonight. Our job is to protect everyone, not to act based on our assumptions and prejudices." Tom shifted in his seat, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. Part of him was glad that Randy was finally facing consequences for his behavior, but he also knew that his own silence had made him complicit. He had watched it happen and said nothing, even though he knew it was wrong. Captain Matthews turned his gaze to Tom, his expression softer but no less serious. "Officer Martin, I want to know why you didn't step in. You stood there and watched as Sergeant Harris escalated a situation that should have been a routine check, and you did nothing to stop it. Why?" Tom hesitated, feeling his face grow hot. He hadn't expected to be put on the spot, but he realized that he deserved it. I didn't know what to do, sir," he admitted quietly. "I knew it was wrong, but Sergeant Harris is my superior. I didn't feel like I had the authority to intervene." Captain Matthews nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. I understand that you're relatively new to the force, Officer Martin. But remember this. It's not about rank or authority. It's about doing what's right. As officers, we have a responsibility to stand up against injustice, even if it means going against our peers. Silence is complicity. Tom felt a pang of guilt, but he also felt a sense of clarity. Captain Matthews was right. He had failed to act, and his silence had allowed Randy's behavior to go unchecked. He vowed to himself that he wouldn't make the same mistake again. Turning back to Randy, Captain Matthews continued, Sergeant Harris, you're suspended, effective immediately. There will be a full investigation into your conduct, and until it's completed, you are relieved of your duties. If this investigation confirms that your actions were motivated by prejudice, there will be further disciplinary action. Randy's face drained of color, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded, the weight of his actions settling over him like a heavy shroud. He had never anticipated that his actions would lead to such consequences, that a moment of arrogance would jeopardize his career. As Captain Matthews dismissed them, Randy and Tom rose from their seats, both feeling the weight of what had transpired. A lesson in humility. As Randy gathered his belongings from his locker, he was met with a mixture of curious and reproachful glances from his fellow officers. Word of his encounter with Captain Williams had spread quickly, and whispers filled the precinct. Randy felt a surge of anger and embarrassment, but he kept his head down, avoiding eye contact. For the first time in his career, he felt vulnerable, exposed. He had always prided himself on being tough, on maintaining authority and control. But now, his authority had been stripped away, and he was left to face the consequences of his actions. As he walked out of the precinct, he couldn't help but think back to the encounter with Captain Williams. The man's calm, dignified demeanor had unsettled him, but now he understood why. Captain Williams hadn't needed to raise his voice or assert his rank to command respect. His quiet strength had spoken volumes, and Randy realized, too late, that respect wasn't something that could be forced. It had to be earned. Reflections and regrets. Meanwhile, Tom sat at his desk, feeling a whirlwind of emotions. He was relieved that Captain Matthews had taken action, but he couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at him. He had known better, yet he had allowed fear and hesitation to paralyze him. In that moment, he realized that he needed to become the kind of officer who wouldn't stay silent in the face of injustice, no matter the circumstances. The next morning, Tom decided to pay a visit to Captain Williams. He found out that the captain was temporarily stationed at a different precinct to avoid media attention following the incident. Tom was nervous, unsure of how the captain would react to his presence, but he knew he had to go. As he entered the precinct, he asked the front desk to direct him to Captain Williams's office. After a few minutes, he was ushered in, finding Captain Williams seated at his desk, reviewing paperwork. The captain looked up, a faint hint of recognition in his eyes. "Officer Martin," he greeted, his tone neutral but not unkind. "What brings you here?" Tom cleared his throat, feeling his palms sweat. "Captain Williams, I wanted to apologize. I know what happened yesterday was wrong, and I should have done something. I didn't know how to handle it." Captain Williams regarded him for a moment, his gaze steady and thoughtful. It's never easy to stand up against someone you work with, especially when that person is in a position of authority. But as officers, we're held to a higher standard. We have to be willing to do what's right, even when it's hard. Tom nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I understand that now. And I want you to know that I'm going to be better. I won't stand by in silence again." A small smile played at the corner of Captain Williams's mouth. "I believe you, Officer Martin. It takes courage to admit when you've made a mistake, and courage is what we need in this line of work." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling over them. Tom felt a sense of relief, as though a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He knew that he still had a lot to learn, but he was determined to become the kind of officer that Captain Williams could be proud of. A new direction for the department. Back at the precinct, Captain Matthews had called a meeting with the entire force. He stood before the assembled officers, his expression somber but resolute. "Yesterday's incident was a reminder of the challenges we still face," he began. "As officers, it is our duty to uphold the law and serve the people of this community without prejudice or discrimination. There is no room for bias in this department. We are here to serve and protect everyone, equally and fairly." The officers listened in silence, some nodding in agreement, others glancing around uneasily. The department had long needed reform, and Captain Matthews' words marked the beginning of a shift in the culture. He emphasized the importance of integrity, of treating every citizen with respect, regardless of appearance or background. In the days that followed, training programs were implemented to address issues of bias and prejudice within the force. Officers were encouraged to engage in open discussions, to reflect on their own biases, and to hold each other accountable. Captain Williams, now officially the new head of the precinct, took an active role in these initiatives, his presence serving as a powerful reminder of the values they all needed to uphold. A change in the ranks. The news of the incident involving Sergeant Randy Harris and Captain David Williams spread beyond the precinct and into the public sphere, sparking a whirlwind of discussions across the city. The video footage taken by bystanders during the encounter went viral, igniting debates about police accountability, prejudice, and the need for reform. The local news covered the story extensively, highlighting Captain Williams's calm and dignified handling of the situation, contrasting it starkly with Sergeant Harris's unprofessional behavior. The department found itself under intense scrutiny. Public trust, already strained, was now in jeopardy. Citizens demanded change, calling for greater transparency, accountability, and training to address systemic issues within law enforcement. For many in the community, Captain Williams became a symbol of hope, a leader who could finally push the department toward meaningful reform. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense and charged. Officers and staff members, many of whom had once brushed off discussions of bias as political correctness, were now forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the culture that had been allowed to fester. The department had always been known for its tough approach, but now there was a growing realization that toughness alone wasn't enough. It needed integrity, fairness, and above all, respect for the community. Captain Matthews, seizing the momentum created by the public outcry, launched a series of changes within the department. He organized a mandatory training program on implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, and de-escalation tactics. Officers were required to attend seminars on community policing and to participate in open discussions about prejudice and its impact on their work. The goal was not only to make the department more accountable, but to transform it from within. A new captain's vision. Captain Williams, now fully settled into his role as the head of the precinct, was determined to lead by example. His calm demeanor and unwavering commitment to justice quickly gained him respect among the officers, even those who had initially resisted his presence. He took an active role in the training sessions, often sharing personal experiences and insights that resonated deeply with the younger officers. In one such session, Captain Williams stood before a room filled with officers, his expression thoughtful as he addressed them. "I know that what happened with Sergeant Harris has shaken a lot of us," he began, his voice calm but commanding. "But what it shows us is that change is needed, not just in our actions, but in our mindset." The officers listened intently, some shifting uncomfortably, others nodding in agreement. Tom Martin sat near the front, hanging onto every word. Since the incident, Tom had felt a renewed sense of purpose. Captain Williams's words and example had shown him what it truly meant to be an officer of the law, and he was determined to become a better version of himself. Captain Williams continued, "We are here to protect and serve everyone, regardless of who they are or what they look like. Our badges do not give us the right to judge. They give us the responsibility to uphold justice. If we fail to treat every citizen with dignity, then we are failing in our duty as officers." He looked around the room, his gaze steady and piercing. This isn't about any one incident. It's about creating a department that serves this community with respect and fairness. I know it won't be easy. Change never is. But I believe in this precinct, and I believe we can set a new standard. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Officers who had once been skeptical of Captain Williams now found themselves inspired by his vision. He was not a man who demanded respect through intimidation or rank. He earned it through his integrity and his commitment to making a difference. Confronting the old guard. Not everyone was enthusiastic about the changes, however. A group of older officers, led by Corporal Dennis Blake, a longtime friend of Randy Harris, resented the new direction the department was taking. They viewed the reforms as a direct attack on the traditional values they believed had kept the city safe. In their eyes, Captain Williams was an outsider who didn't understand the real work of policing. Dennis and a few of his like-minded colleagues gathered in the break room one afternoon, grumbling about the recent changes. "Can you believe this nonsense?" Dennis muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. "We're supposed to sit through all these sensitivity seminars and listen to lectures from some guy who doesn't even know what it's like to be on the streets." Another officer, Gary, nodded in agreement. "Yeah, and we're supposed to take advice from a guy who drives an old beater and thinks he can waltz in here and change everything. I didn't sign up for this feel-good policing stuff." Their conversation was interrupted when Tom Martin entered the break room. He hesitated when he heard their conversation, his stomach twisting with a mix of anger and disappointment. He had looked up to some of these officers when he first joined the force, but now he realized that their attitude was part of the problem. "Got something to say, Martin?" Dennis asked, noticing Tom's hesitation. Tom took a deep breath, summoning his courage. "Yeah, actually, I do. Captain Williams is trying to make this place better, and he's right. We need to treat people with respect, not just go around bullying anyone we think looks suspicious." Dennis sneered. "Kid, you don't know what you're talking about. Policing isn't about making friends. It's about control. It's about showing people who's in charge." Tom felt a surge of determination. "If that's what you think, then maybe you're in the wrong line of work," he retorted. "Because real policing isn't about control. It's about service. And if we're going to call ourselves officers, we need to be better than this." Dennis glared at him, but Tom held his ground, refusing to be intimidated. The tension in the room was thick, but Tom knew he had made the right choice. He walked out, his head held high, feeling a sense of clarity he hadn't known before. He was done being silent. The power of example. As the weeks went by, the impact of Captain Williams's leadership became more evident. Officers who had once been resistant to the changes started to open up, attending the training sessions with genuine interest. Many of them found that their perspectives were evolving as they engaged in conversations they had previously avoided. They began to see the value in community policing, understanding that building trust with the people they served could make their jobs not only easier, but also more meaningful. Captain Williams made a point of getting to know each officer individually, learning about their backgrounds, their motivations, and their struggles. His approach was personal and empathetic, yet firm. He encouraged officers to reach out to community members, to attend neighborhood events, and to get involved with local organizations. Slowly but surely, the department began to repair its relationship with the community. One day, during a community event, Captain Williams led a group of officers to a local youth center where they met with teenagers from various backgrounds. The young people were hesitant at first, skeptical of the officers' intentions. Many of them had grown up hearing stories of negative encounters with the police, and trust was not something they readily offered. But Captain Williams took the time to listen to their concerns, addressing their questions with honesty and respect. He shared stories from his own life, explaining the challenges he had faced as a black man in law enforcement, and how those experiences had shaped his commitment to justice. The youth responded positively, opening up to him and the other officers. They shared their fears, their hopes, and their desire for a safer, more understanding community. By the end of the event, Captain Williams had established a connection with them, a foundation of trust that he hoped would continue to grow. Department transformed. As the months passed, the precinct underwent a transformation that was both profound and Captain Williams regarded him thoughtfully, recognizing the sincerity in his words. "Randy, admitting you were wrong is a step in the right direction. If you're willing to learn and grow, then there's a place for you in this department. But understand that this change isn't temporary. It's who we are now." Randy nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. He knew he had a long road ahead of him, but he was ready to walk it. For the first time, he saw Captain Williams not as an adversary, but as a mentor, someone who could guide him toward becoming the officer he had once aspired to be. Bridging the divide. The changes within the precinct under Captain Williams's leadership continued to ripple outward, reaching parts of the community that had long been disconnected from the police force. While some citizens were slow to trust, the shift in the department's approach was undeniable. Officers were no longer seen as distant, unapproachable figures, but as active, compassionate members of the community. For the first time in years, a sense of genuine connection began to form between the people and those sworn to protect them. Captain Williams knew that trust could not be rebuilt overnight. The city had deep wounds from years of strained relations with law enforcement, and those wounds required careful, deliberate healing. So he spearheaded a new initiative called Bridging the Divide, a program designed to open up direct communication between the police and community members, fostering a space where citizens could share their concerns, experiences, and hopes for the future. The first Bridging the Divide event took place in a local community center, with residents, activists, and neighborhood leaders invited to participate. The event was open to anyone, encouraging a wide range of voices, especially those who had felt marginalized or neglected. Captain Williams knew this would be one of the most challenging but critical steps in the department's transformation. The community speaks out. The turnout was far greater than anyone had anticipated. The large meeting hall quickly filled with people of all ages, ethnicities, and backgrounds. Some wore expressions of skepticism, their arms crossed as they eyed the officers warily. Others looked hopeful, eager to see if this initiative would bring about real change. Captain Williams noticed a few familiar faces among the crowd, people he had met during previous community events, who had given him a cautious chance but hadn't yet fully embraced the department's efforts. Alongside Captain Williams, Officer Tom Martin stood with a sense of nervous anticipation. Since the incident with Randy, Tom had committed himself to being part of the change he wanted to see. He'd volunteered for every community outreach program, every training session, and every initiative Captain Williams had organized. Tonight, he was determined to listen, to absorb every word spoken by the community, and to internalize it. As the event began, Captain Williams took the stage, his presence commanding but warm. He introduced himself and the purpose of the event, his voice calm and steady. "We are here tonight because this city deserves a police force that is accountable, respectful, and dedicated to the well-being of every single citizen." He began, his words resonating in the quiet hall. "This isn't about us telling you what we're going to do. This is about you telling us what needs to change." He paused, allowing his words to settle in the air, before continuing. "We are listening. We are committed. And we know that change won't happen without your voices, your stories, and your guidance." With that, he opened the floor to anyone who wished to speak. A hush fell over the crowd as people exchanged glances, some hesitant to be the first to voice their thoughts. Finally, a woman in her late 40s stood up, her face lined with years of worry and pain. "My name is Gloria," she said, her voice carrying both strength and sorrow. "I lost my son 5 years ago in an encounter with the police. He wasn't perfect, but he didn't deserve what happened to him. Since then, I've had a hard time trusting anyone with a badge." The room fell silent as Gloria's words echoed, her grief palpable. Captain Williams listened intently, his heart heavy with empathy. He knew that healing required acknowledging the pain that people like Gloria carried, a pain that couldn't simply be erased with good intentions. "We cannot bring your son back, Gloria," Captain Williams responded gently, meeting her gaze. "But we can promise you this. We will work tirelessly to prevent this kind of tragedy from happening to another family. And we'll do it by listening to voices like yours, by understanding the pain you feel, and by committing ourselves to real accountability." Another man, a young father, raised his hand and stood up. His voice was filled with frustration, but also a glimmer of hope. "I want my kids to grow up in a city where they don't have to be afraid of the police. But I'm tired of empty promises. We've heard change before. What makes this time any different?" Captain Williams nodded, understanding the skepticism. "You're right to be cautious," he said, "and I won't ask you to trust us blindly. But what I can offer you is transparency and action. We're implementing new policies, we're holding our officers accountable, and we're building partnerships with community leaders. If we fail to live up to these promises, I expect you to hold us to task." As more people stood to share their stories, grievances, and concerns, the officers in attendance listened quietly, some visibly moved by the stories they heard. Captain Williams had encouraged his team to take in the words of the community, to understand that this was the reality they had been sheltered from for too long. Randy's redemption. Meanwhile, Randy Harris, now on suspension, was struggling with his own internal reckoning. He had spent his entire career clinging to the idea that strength meant asserting control, that respect could be demanded rather than earned. But the events of the past weeks had shattered those beliefs, forcing him to confront the biases he'd harbored and the harm he had caused. One evening, as he sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, he found himself reflecting on a memory from his early days on the force. He remembered his first mentor, an old officer named Frank, who had told him, "Respect is a two-way street, kid. You don't get it unless you give it." At the time, Randy had dismissed Frank's words, thinking them soft and naive. But now, they echoed in his mind, a painful reminder of the wisdom he had ignored. Determined to make amends, Randy reached out to Captain Williams, requesting a meeting. He didn't know if the captain would even be willing to speak with him, but he felt he owed it to himself and to the department to try. When Captain Williams agreed to meet, Randy felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. The two men sat across from each other in a small meeting room, an air of tension and unspoken understanding between them. "I'm not here to make excuses," Randy began, his voice low but resolute. "I know I messed up, and I know that an apology doesn't erase what I did. But I want to learn, Captain. I want to be part of the change you're building here." Captain Williams regarded him thoughtfully, recognizing the sincerity in Randy's eyes. "Change isn't easy, Randy. It requires more than words. It requires action, reflection, and a willingness to be uncomfortable. Are you willing to go through that?" Randy nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I am. I want to earn back the respect I lost, and I want to be a better officer than I've been." Captain Williams extended his hand, and Randy shook it, feeling a sense of hope for the first time in weeks. He knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but he was ready to put in the work. Bridging the Divide continued. The Bridging the Divide events became a regular occurrence, held monthly in different parts of the city. Each session brought new voices, new stories, and new insights. Over time, the initial skepticism gave way to cautious optimism, as citizens saw that the department was genuinely committed to listening and learning. One evening, during one of these events, Tom Martin had an encounter that would change him forever. A young black teenager named Malik stood up to speak, his expression defiant yet vulnerable. "I don't trust the police," Malik said, his voice steady but filled with anger. "You guys say you're here to protect us, but every time I walk down the street, I feel like a target. I've been stopped, searched, and treated like a criminal just because of how I look." Tom felt a pang of shame as he listened to Malik's words, recalling his own hesitations during the encounter with Randy. He realized that his silence had made him complicit, that his failure to speak up had contributed to the very distrust Malik was describing. After the event, Tom approached Malik, wanting to hear more of his perspective. "Hey, Malik," he said, offering a small smile. "I'm Officer Martin. I just wanted to thank you for speaking up tonight. I can't imagine what you've been through, but I want to understand." Malik eyed him warily, but after a moment, he softened. "It's just hard, you know. I don't feel safe around people who are supposed to protect me. I shouldn't have to feel like that." Tom nodded, his voice filled with sincerity. "You're right. You shouldn't. And I'm sorry that you've had to feel that way. But I promise you, I'm going to do everything I can to change that. Not just for you, but for everyone in this community." The two talked for a while, finding common ground in their desire for a safer, more just city. Malik's distrust didn't disappear overnight, but Tom's willingness to listen and empathize planted a seed of understanding. For Tom, this conversation was a turning point, a reminder of why he had joined the force and the kind of officer he wanted to become. The ripple effect. As the precinct continued its transformation, word of the department's efforts spread to neighboring cities. Other precincts began reaching out to Captain Williams, seeking guidance on implementing similar reforms. The Bridging the Divide model was adopted in multiple communities, sparking a larger movement for police accountability and transparency. Captain Williams felt a deep sense of pride as he witnessed the impact of his leadership, but he knew there was still work to be done. He remained committed to his mission, guiding his officers with patience and unwavering resolve. The precinct, once known for its tough, unyielding approach, became a symbol of hope and progress, a department that had faced its flaws and chosen a path of growth and integrity. And while the journey was far from over, the changes that had begun with one fateful encounter now held the promise of a brighter future for the entire city. Redemption and responsibility. Randy Harris's journey back to the precinct was nothing short of humbling. Following his suspension, he had attended every mandatory training session, workshop, and community outreach program organized by Captain Williams. Initially, he had found it hard to accept the changes, feeling exposed and vulnerable as he was forced to confront his own biases. But over time, his resistance gave way to reflection. Randy realized that his past actions hadn't just jeopardized his career, they had undermined his own integrity and harmed the people he had sworn to protect. He knew that simply attending these sessions wouldn't be enough. He needed to rebuild himself from the ground up. When his suspension was lifted, Randy returned to the precinct with a renewed sense of purpose. He was met with mixed reactions. Some officers eyed him warily, while others regarded him with open skepticism. A few officers who had once considered him a friend had distanced themselves, unsure of who he had become. Randy could hardly blame them. He knew he would have to prove himself all over again. One of the first tasks Captain Williams assigned to him was working with the community outreach team, a role Randy would have scoffed at in the past. Now, he saw it as an opportunity to repair the damage he had caused. He spent his days meeting with neighborhood groups, listening to their concerns, and offering support wherever he could. He found himself in difficult conversations, often with people who were still wary of the police and skeptical of his intentions. But Randy understood that healing wouldn't happen overnight, and he approached each interaction with patience and humility. A difficult encounter. One afternoon, Randy and Tom Martin were scheduled to meet with a local youth group at the city's community center. The group, consisting of teens from various backgrounds, had been vocal about their distrust of the police. Captain Williams saw this as an opportunity for both Randy and Tom to build bridges and hopefully earn some trust within the community. The room was filled with a tense silence as Randy and Tom entered. The teenagers exchanged wary glances, some whispering to one another as they sized up the two officers. Randy felt the weight of their skepticism pressing down on him, a reminder of his past mistakes. The youth leader, Ms. Henderson, a strong-willed woman with a fierce dedication to her community, stood at the front of the room, arms crossed as she observed the officers. "Thank you both for coming," she said, her tone polite but reserved. "The kids have a lot on their minds, and they need to feel safe in sharing their experiences. Randy nodded, clearing his throat. We're here to listen. We're not here to lecture or make excuses. I know trust has been broken, and I take full responsibility for my role in that. But I'm committed to making things right. A young man named Jamal raised his hand, his expression a mix of anger and hurt. Why should we believe you? He asked, his voice steady but filled with resentment. You cops always say you're gonna change, but it's all just talk. My cousin was pulled over last month just because he looked suspicious. He wasn't doing anything wrong, but he got treated like a criminal. How's that fair? Randy looked Jamal in the eyes, feeling the weight of his words. It's not fair, he admitted, his voice solemn. And I'm sorry that happened to your cousin. I can't change the past, but I'm here to change the future. It starts with acknowledging the mistakes we've made and committing to do better. Jamal folded his arms, his expression softening slightly, though he still looked skeptical. It's hard to trust words, he muttered. We've been let down too many times. Tom, who had been silent until now, spoke up. You're right, Jamal. And we know that actions speak louder than words. That's why we're here. Not just to talk, but to listen to what you need from us. We want to make sure this community feels safe, and that starts with understanding what you've been through. The conversation continued, with the teens sharing stories of encounters with law enforcement that had left them feeling scared and dehumanized. Randy and Tom listened intently, absorbing every word. Randy felt a deep sense of regret as he heard their stories, recognizing the impact of the very behavior he had once embodied. At the end of the session, Ms. Henderson approached Randy, her gaze thoughtful. I appreciate you coming here, she said. I know it's not easy to face these kids, especially after what they've been through. But if you're serious about change, this is the way to start. Randy nodded, his expression resolute. I am serious, Ms. Henderson. I know it'll take time, but I'm committed to earning back their trust. Building trust, step by step. As the weeks went by, Randy threw himself into community outreach with a level of dedication that surprised even himself. He volunteered for every neighborhood meeting, attended events on his days off, and made an effort to connect with residents on a personal level. Slowly, people began to see him not just as a police officer, but as a person, a man willing to confront his past mistakes and work toward a better future. One evening, as Randy was leaving the precinct, he noticed a familiar face waiting outside. It was Jamal, the teenager from the youth group. He approached Randy with a cautious expression, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Hey, Officer Harris, Jamal began, shifting his weight nervously. I just wanted to say, thanks for listening to us the other day. I didn't think you'd actually care. Randy smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in a long time. Thank you, Jamal. It means a lot that you came to tell me this. I want you to know that I'm here for you and your friends. If there's ever anything you need, you can come to me. Jamal nodded, a faint smile breaking through his guarded demeanor. I'll keep that in mind. Maybe things can change after all. As Jamal walked away, Randy felt a sense of pride and hope. It was a small victory, but it was a step forward. He knew there would be setbacks, that not everyone would be so quick to forgive, but he was willing to keep trying, one conversation at a time. A new partnership with the community. Inspired by Randy's transformation, Captain Williams proposed a new initiative, a community partnership program that paired officers with local residents and business owners. The goal was to foster direct relationships between the police and the people they served, creating a network of trust and accountability. Under this program, Randy was paired with a local shop owner named Mrs. Lee, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for over 50 years. She had seen the community change and had watched as tensions between residents and the police grew over time. Mrs. Lee was known for her kindness and her wisdom, but she had been wary of the police ever since a break-in at her shop years ago had gone largely ignored by the previous precinct leadership. When Randy first met Mrs. Lee, She regarded him with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "So, you're the officer they sent to look after us?" she asked, her eyes sharp. Randy smiled, understanding her hesitation. "Yes, ma'am. I know the department hasn't always been there for you, but I'm here to change that. If there's anything you need, or if you ever feel unsafe, you can count on me." Mrs. Lee studied him for a moment before nodding. "I'll believe it when I see it," she replied, a glint of challenge in her eyes. Over the next few weeks, Randy made regular visits to Mrs. Lee's shop, helping her with small tasks and checking in on her well-being. He shared stories of his family, his upbringing, and the journey that had brought him to this moment. Slowly, Mrs. Lee's skepticism began to melt away, replaced by a budding trust. One evening, when a group of teenagers began loitering outside the shop, Mrs. Lee grew anxious, fearing trouble. Randy happened to be passing by and noticed her discomfort. He approached the teens, but instead of ordering them to leave, he struck up a conversation, asking them about school, their interests, and their goals. Within minutes, they were laughing and sharing stories, the tension dissipating. Mrs. Lee watched from the doorway, her heart warmed by the sight. She approached Randy afterward, her expression softened. "Maybe you're different after all," she said quietly. "Maybe this department is finally becoming what it was meant to be." A ripple effect. Randy's renewed commitment and his efforts in the community began to have a ripple effect within the precinct. Officers who had once been skeptical of the changes now saw Randy as an example of what was possible. They watched as he rebuilt relationships with residents, as he faced his past mistakes with humility, and as he dedicated himself to service with a newfound sense of purpose. Tom, who had always admired Captain Williams, now found inspiration in Randy's journey as well. He began to see that change was not only possible but necessary, and he vowed to follow in the footsteps of both his mentors, striving to be an officer who was respected not for his badge, but for his character. Under Captain Williams's leadership, the precinct continued to evolve, transforming from a place of rigid authority to a community-focused department rooted in compassion and justice. Officers were encouraged to participate in community events, to get to know the people they served, and to engage in open dialogue with residents. The precinct became a beacon of hope, not just for the city but for other departments as well. News of the transformation spread, inspiring other precincts to adopt similar programs and initiatives. The impact of Captain Williams's vision, Randy's redemption, and the collective effort of the precinct was felt far and wide. A pledge renewed. Months later, Captain Williams gathered his officers for a ceremony, where they collectively renewed their oath to serve the community with integrity and respect. Randy stood among them, his heart filled with gratitude and pride. He had come full circle, from a man ruled by arrogance and prejudice to an officer committed to justice and empathy. As they raised their right hands, repeating the words of their oath, Randy felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew that his journey was far from over, but he also knew that he was no longer the man he had once been. He was stronger, wiser, and ready to serve in the truest sense of the word. Captain Williams watched with pride as his officers pledged their dedication. He knew the road ahead would still hold challenges, but he was confident that together they would face them with courage, compassion, and a shared commitment to making their city a better place for everyone. The legacy of change. A year had passed since that fateful encounter that sparked transformation within the precinct. The city had witnessed a complete cultural shift in its law enforcement, one that seemed unimaginable before Captain Williams took the reins. What had started as an incident born out of prejudice and arrogance had evolved into a movement of unity, respect, and resilience. The precinct became a model for other departments across the state, inspiring hope in a community that had once harbored deep distrust. The transformation wasn't easy, and the road had been filled with challenges, but the officers of the precinct had embraced this journey with a sense of purpose and pride. They had come to understand that policing was not about exerting authority. It was about serving with empathy and standing as protectors of all, without bias or prejudice. Now, The precinct was preparing for its annual community open house event, a day where officers and community members came together to celebrate the strides they had made, to share their stories, and to renew their commitment to each other. This year's event held a special significance as it was dedicated to recognizing the community partnerships that had been built, the lives that had been touched, and the people who had helped make this change possible. Captain Williams stood in the middle of the precinct's newly renovated community room, watching as officers and residents set up tables, hung banners, and decorated the space with bright, welcoming colors. There was an air of excitement and pride, a tangible sense of accomplishment that made the captain's heart swell with gratitude. This was the precinct he had always dreamed of leading, one that reflected the best of humanity and showed unwavering dedication to the people it served. As he walked around, he spotted Randy Harris carefully arranging chairs and chatting with some of the youth group members he'd come to know well over the past year. Randy had come a long way from the man he used to be. He had dedicated himself to rebuilding his reputation, his relationships, and most importantly, his values. The community now saw him not as a figure of intimidation, but as a friend, a mentor, and a man who had learned from his mistakes. Nearby, Tom Martin was helping an elderly woman, Mrs. Lee, set up her booth showcasing art created by local youth. Tom's journey had been transformative as well, and he was now widely respected as a compassionate and dedicated officer. Inspired by Captain Williams and Randy's examples, Tom had become a role model for younger recruits, showing them that policing with heart and integrity was not only possible but essential. Honoring the community. As the event began, people from all walks of life filled the precinct, laughing, chatting, and exploring the various booths set up by local businesses, artists, and community organizations. Officers mingled with the crowd, sharing stories, playing games with kids, and engaging in conversations that reminded everyone of the progress they had made together. At the center of the room, a stage had been set up for the evening's main event, a ceremony recognizing the individuals who had played a crucial role in the precinct's transformation. Captain Williams had worked closely with community leaders to create this moment, understanding that the department's achievements were not its own, but were a result of collaboration with the people it served. The ceremony began with a speech by Miss Henderson, the youth group leader who had been a vocal advocate for change. She spoke of the importance of accountability and trust, of officers who had opened their hearts to listen to the voices of the community. She spoke of Randy's journey, of Tom's courage, and of Captain Williams's unwavering dedication. Her words were met with applause and cheers from the audience, a testament to the bond that had been forged between the precinct and the community. Next, Captain Williams took the stage. He looked out at the sea of faces, seeing not just residents but friends, partners, and allies. He had led many ceremonies in his career, but none had felt as meaningful as this one. Tonight, he began, his voice filled with pride. We celebrate not only the changes within this precinct, but the resilience and strength of this community. A year ago, we were strangers, divided by mistrust and pain. Today, we stand here as one, united by a commitment to justice, respect, and compassion. He paused, allowing his words to resonate. This transformation wasn't easy. It required each of us, officers and citizens alike, to confront uncomfortable truths, to listen with open hearts, and to work together toward a common goal. And because of that work, we have become more than a department and a community. We have become family. The room erupted in applause, and Captain Williams took a step back, gesturing for Randy to join him on stage. Randy looked surprised, his face flushing as he approached the podium. Sergeant Randy Harris has become a symbol of growth and redemption, Captain Williams said. He's shown us that it's never too late to learn, to change, and to make amends. Randy, your journey has inspired us all, and your dedication to this community has proven that you are, and will always be, an invaluable part of this family. Randy looked out at the crowd, his eyes filled with emotion. He had never expected to find himself in this position, to be celebrated for the very qualities he had once taken for granted. He cleared his throat, steadying his voice. "I just want to say thank you," Randy began, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you for giving me a chance to make things right, for holding me accountable, and for believing that I could be better. I'm proud to serve this community, and I promise to continue earning your trust every single day." The applause was deafening, and as Randy stepped off the stage, he was embraced by members of the youth group, by Mrs. Lee, and by officers who had once doubted him, but now respected him deeply. An unforeseen crisis. As the evening continued, laughter and joy filled the precinct. But just as Captain Williams was beginning to relax, his phone buzzed with an alert. His expression shifted as he read the message. It was an emergency call. There had been a fire in one of the apartment buildings in a nearby neighborhood, and the fire department was requesting immediate assistance with evacuation. Without missing a beat, Captain Williams addressed the crowd. Randy and Tom immediately took charge, helping guide people to safety, searching for anyone still trapped inside. Randy saw a young woman frantically calling out for her child, who she feared was still in their apartment on the second floor. "Stay here," Randy told her, his voice firm. "We'll find your child and bring them to you." Without hesitation, he and Tom entered the building, navigating through the dense smoke and flames. They called out, listening for any response, until they heard the faint cry of a child coming from one of the rooms. With his heart pounding, Randy found the little girl hiding under a bed, her face streaked with tears. "It's okay, sweetheart," he whispered gently, lifting her into his arms. "You're safe now. Let's get you back to your mom." As they emerged from the building, the crowd cheered, the relief palpable as Randy reunited the girl with her mother. The woman hugged her daughter tightly, tears streaming down her face as she thanked Randy over and over. In that moment, Randy realized that this was what it truly meant to serve, not to wield authority or demand respect, but to protect, to help, and to be there for those who needed him most. It was a humbling realization, one that filled him with a renewed sense of purpose, a lasting legacy. The fire incident became another chapter in the precinct's story of redemption. The bravery displayed by Randy, Tom, and the entire team that night only strengthened the bond between the department and the community. News of their heroism spread, and the precinct was praised not just for its response, but for the trust it had earned through months of dedication and hard work. In the weeks that followed, the community continued to heal and grow closer. The precinct was no longer just a building. It had become a pillar of support, a place where people felt safe, respected, and valued. The officers were no longer faceless enforcers of the law. They were friends, mentors, and protectors, deeply connected to the people they served. Captain Williams, reflecting on the journey they had all taken, felt a profound sense of satisfaction. He knew that change was never truly complete, that there would always be challenges and setbacks. But he also knew that they had built something unbreakable, a legacy of compassion, integrity, and unity that would guide the precinct for generations to come. On a quiet evening, as the city lights sparkled outside his office window, Captain Williams raised a glass in a private toast to his team, his community, and the journey they had shared. He knew that his work was far from over, but for the first time in his career, he felt that he had truly made a difference, and he was ready to continue leading with heart, courage, and an unshakable commitment to justice.